May 10th, 1940, somewhere in the Ardennes forest, Belgium. 3 a.m. Private Heinrich Böll sat in the back of a Wehrmacht truck, surrounded by sleeping soldiers. He wasn't tired. He couldn't sleep even if he wanted to. His heart was racing. His hands were trembling slightly. His eyes felt unnaturally wide open, like he hadn't blinked in an hour. 3 hours earlier, his squad leader had distributed small white pills to everyone in the unit. "Take 2, the sergeant had said casually, like he was handing out candy. "We march at midnight. We don't stop until we reach France." Heinrich had swallowed the pills without question. Within 30 minutes, the fatigue that had been weighing him down for days simply vanished. He felt alert, energized, almost euphoric, like he could march 100 kilometers without rest. He had no idea he'd just taken methamphetamine, what we know today as crystal meth. The German military called it Pervitin, and between 1939 and 1945, they distributed over 200 million doses to Wehrmacht soldiers, Luftwaffe pilots, and Kriegsmarine sailors. It was standard issue, like ammunition, like rations. "Take your pills, soldier. March faster, fight longer, don't ask questions." Meanwhile, 3,000 miles west in Kentucky, American Private James Morrison was finishing his coffee in the Fort Knox mess hall. The coffee was strong, hot, and came with 2 pieces of chocolate from his morning ration. He felt awake, alert, ready for training. But he wasn't chemically supercharged, he was just caffeinated. This is the story of how Nazi Germany built its Blitzkrieg on methamphetamine and how that decision helped lose them the war. This is the story of 2 armies, one fueled by industrial-grade stimulants that destroyed their soldiers from within, and one fueled by coffee and chocolate that kept them functioning for years. The mathematics was simple. Germany chose short-term superhuman performance at the cost of long-term collapse. America chose sustainable energy that soldiers could maintain indefinitely. One strategy worked for months, the other worked for years, and in a war of attrition, years beat months every single time. 1937, Berlin. The birth of a wonder drug. The story begins in a pharmaceutical laboratory in Berlin. Dr. Fritz Hauschild, working for Temmler Pharmaceutical Company, had just synthesized a new stimulant drug, methamphetamine. It was a close chemical cousin to amphetamine, but significantly more potent. The drug produced remarkable effects. Users reported increased alertness, enhanced concentration, reduced need for sleep, elevated mood, and a sense of almost superhuman confidence and capability. 1 dose could keep a person awake and active for 8 to 12 hours. 2 doses, 24 hours of sustained activity with no apparent fatigue. Temmler Pharmaceuticals began selling the drug in German pharmacies in late 1937 under the brand name Pervitin. It was available over the counter, no prescription needed. Just walk into a pharmacy and buy methamphetamine pills like aspirin. The marketing was brilliant. Advertisements showed cheerful workers, alert students, and energetic housewives. "Pervitin, your daily companion for work and leisure," claimed one advertisement. Another showed a mother using Pervitin to handle household chores while caring for children. German civilians loved it. Factory workers used it to handle double shifts. Students used it to study through the night. Housewives used it to manage demanding schedules. By 1938, Pervitin was one of the best-selling medications in Germany. Nobody called it methamphetamine. Nobody called it dangerous. It was just medicine. Modern science making life better. But then the German military noticed something interesting. If Pervitin could keep factory workers alert for extended shifts, what could it do for soldiers? 1939, the Wehrmacht discovers its secret weapon. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The campaign lasted just over a month, and Polish forces were overwhelmed by the speed and aggression of the German assault. Wehrmacht soldiers seemed to operate with superhuman endurance, marching longer, fighting harder, and maintaining operational tempo that exhausted defending forces. Part of this was tactical innovation, part was mechanical superiority, but there was another factor that most historians overlooked until recently. The soldiers were high on methamphetamine. Dr. Otto Ranke, a military doctor working for the German Army Medical Service, had been conducting experiments with Pervitin on soldiers throughout 1938 and early 1939. His research showed remarkable results. Soldiers given Pervitin could march 55 miles in a single session without rest. They showed enhanced reaction times, reduced fear responses, increased aggression, and most importantly, they required almost no sleep. Ranke's report to military leadership was enthusiastic. Pervitin produces a state of euphoria, increased self-confidence, and improved concentration. The need for sleep is suppressed. Performance is increased even when significant fatigue is present. The Wehrmacht was convinced. In April 1940, as Germany prepared for the invasion of France and the Low Countries, military leadership approved mass distribution of Pervitin to combat troops. The logistics were extraordinary. Between April and June 1940, during the 3-month campaign in France, the German military distributed approximately 35 million Pervitin tablets. That's about 12 tablets per soldier for the entire campaign. Records show that some frontline units received deliveries of hundreds of thousands of pills at a time. Soldiers were instructed to take 2 pills before operations, with additional doses available if missions extended beyond expected timeframes. Tank crews took Pervitin to handle the physical and mental demands of extended combat operations. Pilots used it for long-range missions. Even naval personnel received distributions for extended patrols. May 1940, Blitzkrieg on speed. The invasion of France began on May 10, 1940. German forces moved with unprecedented speed and aggression. Tank columns drove for days without stopping. Infantry units marched continuously, covering distances that seemed impossible. Commanders reported that their troops showed minimal signs of fatigue, even after 72 hours of continuous operations. General Heinz Guderian, commanding the panzer forces that broke through French lines, marveled at his soldiers' endurance. His forces advanced so quickly that they repeatedly outran their own supply lines, yet the troops continued operating effectively. Psychological dependency. Soldiers felt unable to function without the drug, deteriorating mental health, increased rates of anxiety, depression and psychotic symptoms, cardiovascular problems, elevated heart rates, high blood pressure, cardiac arrhythmias, aggressive and erratic behavior. Some soldiers showed paranoia and violence even toward fellow troops. The report recommended restricting Pervitin use to emergency situations only. Soldiers should not receive the drug as standard issue. Military leadership ignored the recommendation. The war was expanding. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was being planned. They would need soldiers capable of operating in the vast distances of Russia. Pervitin solved that problem. The side effects were unfortunate but acceptable. June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa begins. The invasion of the Soviet Union was the largest military operation in history. 3 million German soldiers crossed the border, advancing on a 2,000-mile front. The distances were enormous, the logistics were nightmarish, and once again Pervitin became standard issue. Records show that between June and December 1941, the Wehrmacht distributed approximately 30 million Pervitin tablets to troops on the Eastern Front. That's in addition to the millions of pills distributed to units in other theaters. For the first few months, the strategy seemed to work. German forces advanced rapidly, covering hundreds of miles, capturing millions of Soviet prisoners, destroying thousands of Soviet tanks and aircraft. Wehrmacht soldiers showed the same superhuman endurance they had demonstrated in France. But then winter came. and the pharmaceutical strategy collapsed. Winter 1941, the crash. By November 1941, German forces were exhausted, not just normally tired, completely, utterly, catastrophically depleted. Soldiers who had been operating on Pervitin for months were experiencing systemic breakdown. The drug that had given them superhuman endurance was now demanding payment. Bodies that had been pushed beyond normal limits, sustained artificially by methamphetamine, were shutting down. Soldiers couldn't function. Units that should have been combat effective were barely capable of basic tasks. Dr. Heinrich Böll, serving as a medical officer with Army Group Center, wrote in his diary, "The men are broken, not from enemy action, but from exhaustion beyond anything I've seen. They've been running on chemistry, and now the chemistry has run out. Some can barely walk, others hallucinate. Many have developed tremors they can't control, and it's not just a few, it's endemic across the entire front." The winter of 1941-42 saw German offensive operations grind to a halt. Hitler blamed the generals blamed the weather. Nobody publicly acknowledged the pharmaceutical dimension. But military medical records tell a different story, an army that had chemically burned itself out. By early 1942, the German military officially restricted Pervitin distribution. It was no longer standard issue. It could only be prescribed by medical officers for specific circumstances. The era of methamphetamine-fueled Blitzkrieg was over, but the damage was done. An entire generation of Wehrmacht soldiers had developed dependencies, psychological damage, and physical deterioration from prolonged stimulant use. The German military never fully recovered the operational tempo it had achieved in 1940. They were still a formidable fighting force, but the superhuman edge was gone. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the American military was taking a very different approach. 1941. America enters the war with coffee. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, American military planners studied German tactics carefully. They noted the Wehrmacht's aggressive operational tempo. They observed the apparent superhuman endurance of German troops. Some American commanders asked, "Should we develop similar pharmaceutical enhancements for our troops?" The answer from U.S. military medical services was a decisive no. Major Howard Snyder, serving with the Army Medical Corps, wrote a memo in March 1942 explaining the decision. Chemical stimulants produce short-term benefits at severe long-term costs. Soldiers cannot maintain indefinite operations on methamphetamine without eventually experiencing complete physical and psychological collapse. The German experience demonstrates that pharmaceutical enhancement is not a sustainable military strategy. Instead, the US military focused on a different stimulant, coffee. Coffee had been part of American military rations since the Civil War. By World War II, it was considered essential. Every American soldier received ground coffee as part of his standard rations. Field kitchens prepared coffee at every opportunity. Even K rations, the individual combat meals, included instant coffee packets. The mathematics were simple. Coffee contains caffeine, a mild stimulant. A typical cup contains about 95 milligrams of caffeine, enough to increase alertness and reduce fatigue without inducing artificial euphoria or superhuman endurance. More importantly, coffee was sustainable. Soldiers could drink it every day for years without developing the severe physiological and psychological problems associated with methamphetamine. Nobody crashes from coffee the way they crash from meth. Nobody develops psychosis from caffeine. Nobody's heart gives out from drinking too much coffee unless they're trying really hard. American military rations also included chocolate. Every D ration and K ration contained chocolate bars. Not for flavor, for energy. Chocolate contains small amounts of caffeine and theobromine, another mild stimulant. It provides quick calories, and it improves morale. The American approach wasn't about creating superhuman soldiers. It was about maintaining steady, sustainable performance over extended periods. No artificial highs, no catastrophic crashes, just adequate energy consistently delivered day after day, month after month, year after year. 1944. 2 armies, 2 fuels. By 1944, the contrast between German and American forces was stark. German soldiers on the Western Front were exhausted. Years of war had depleted them physically and psychologically. The earlier pharmaceutical enhancements had left lasting damage. Many veterans from the Eastern Front showed symptoms consistent with long-term stimulant abuse: depression, anxiety, paranoia, cardiovascular problems. Medical records from German field hospitals in 1944 show thousands of cases of soldiers suffering from what doctors called exhaustion syndrome: chronic fatigue, inability to sleep, tremors, psychological instability. These weren't casualties from combat. They were casualties from the war the German military had waged against its own soldiers' bodies through pharmaceutical abuse. American forces landing in Normandy, by contrast, were fresh, well-supplied, and sustainably fueled. Every morning, field kitchens provided hot coffee. Rations included chocolate. Soldiers received adequate sleep between operations. They weren't superhuman. They were just adequately rested, adequately caffeinated, and capable of sustained operations. The difference showed in operational tempo. German forces in 1944 couldn't maintain the aggressive, continuous operations they had achieved in 1940. When they attacked, they could sustain offensives for days, maybe a week, before exhaustion forced pauses. American forces could operate continuously for months. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 illustrated this contrast perfectly. Germany's last major offensive required every available resource. German soldiers were given emergency distributions of Pervitin to sustain the attack. For a few days, it worked. German forces drove deep into American lines, creating chaos and panic. But within a week, the pharmaceutical enhancement wore off. German soldiers, already exhausted, crashed hard. Units that should have been pressing advantages were barely capable of defensive operations. Meanwhile, American forces, fueled by adequate rest and regular coffee, maintained steady pressure until German resistance collapsed. 1945, the final accounting. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Allied medical teams examining captured Wehrmacht soldiers found widespread evidence of stimulant abuse consequences. Thousands showed signs of long-term methamphetamine damage. Many were severely addicted. Some required extended medical treatment just to stabilize their neurological and cardiovascular systems. Post-war studies found that approximately 10 to 15% of Wehrmacht veterans suffered long-term health problems directly attributable to military-issued stimulant use. Depression, anxiety, cardiovascular disease, and neurological problems were endemic among soldiers who had used Pervitin extensively during 1940-1941. American soldiers, by contrast, went home healthy. Coffee didn't leave lasting damage. Chocolate didn't cause addiction. The mild stimulants that sustained American forces for years of combat required no medical intervention after the war ended. The pharmaceutical strategy had seemed brilliant in 1940. Give soldiers drugs, make them superhuman, win quickly. But wars don't end quickly. And superhuman performance isn't sustainable. Eventually, chemistry fails. Bodies break down. Soldiers become casualties of their own enhancements. Germany had chosen the sprint. America had chosen the marathon. And World War II was a marathon. The mathematics of stimulants. Let's examine the numbers, because numbers tell the story clearly. German Pervitin distribution, 1939 to 1942, over 200 million tablets. Average dose, 2-4 tablets per soldier per major operation. Effect duration, 8-12 hours of artificial alertness per dose. Crash period, 12-24 hours of severe fatigue and depression after extended use. Long-term consequences, physical and psychological damage in approximately 10-15% of users. American coffee distribution, 1941-1945. Approximately 32 pounds of coffee per soldier per year. Average consumption, 3 to 4 cups per day. Effect duration, 2 to 4 hours of mild alertness per cup. Crash period, minimal. Coffee doesn't produce the severe crashes associated with methamphetamine. Long-term consequences, essentially none. Coffee is sustainable indefinitely. The difference is obvious. Pervitin produced intense, short-duration effects at severe long-term cost. Coffee produced mild, sustainable effects with minimal negative consequences. In a 6-week campaign like France in 1940, Pervitin worked. Soldiers could operate at superhuman levels for a few weeks, win the war, and deal with consequences later. But in a multi-year conflict like the Eastern Front or the Atlantic War, Pervitin was a disaster. You can't sustain armies on methamphetamine for years. Bodies fail, minds break, armies collapse. Coffee, boring as it seems, was the superior military strategy. Adequate rather than optimal. Sustainable rather than spectacular. But adequate and sustainable wins wars. Optimal and unsustainable loses them. The psychological dimension. There's another factor often overlooked in discussions of military stimulants: psychological impact. Soldiers using Pervitin initially felt invincible. The artificial confidence the drug produced made them more aggressive, more willing to take risks, more certain of victory. This psychological effect was actually beneficial in short campaigns, where German forces had tactical advantages and momentum was critical. But as the war dragged on, the psychological consequences became devastating. Soldiers who had felt superhuman while using Pervitin felt hopeless when the drug stopped. Depression was endemic. Morale collapsed. Many soldiers reported that coming off Pervitin felt like falling into a black pit where nothing matters anymore. American soldiers drinking coffee never experienced artificial euphoria. They never felt superhuman. They just felt normally alert, awake, ready to work. When the coffee ran out, they were tired. When it was available again, they perked up. No psychological roller coaster. No artificial highs followed by crushing lows, just steady, normal, sustainable alertness. This matters more than it seems. Armies aren't just fighting against external enemies. They're fighting internal battles against despair, fatigue, and hopelessness. The side that maintains stable, sustainable morale over years of combat has an enormous advantage. German soldiers in 1945 were psychologically shattered. Years of chemical manipulation of their neurological systems had left them unable to sustain normal morale without artificial enhancement. American soldiers in 1945 were tired, certainly, but they weren't broken. They could still function, they could still fight, they could still believe victory was possible. Coffee didn't win the war, but coffee didn't lose the war either. And sometimes not losing is how you win. Post-war legacy. After the war ended, both former German soldiers and medical researchers tried to understand what had happened. How had a pharmaceutical wonder drug that seemed so promising in 1939 turned into a disaster by 1945? Dr. Werner Pichocki, who had served as a Wehrmacht medical officer during the war, wrote in 1947, "We thought we had found a way to enhance human capability beyond natural limits. We were wrong. Human bodies have limits for good reasons. Pushing beyond those limits with chemistry doesn't eliminate the consequences. It just delays them. And when payment comes due, it comes due with interest. We destroyed an entire generation of soldiers trying to make them superhuman." Post-war studies of Wehrmacht veterans found persistent effects decades after the war ended. Soldiers who had used Pervitin extensively in 1940-1941 showed elevated rates of cardiovascular disease, depression, and neurological problems well into the 1970s and 1980s. The drug they took for a few months left marks that lasted their entire lives. American veterans, by contrast, showed no similar patterns. Coffee doesn't leave scars. Chocolate doesn't cause lifelong health problems. The mild stimulants that fueled the American military effort had no lasting consequences. There's a lesson here that extends beyond World War II. Organizations often look for enhancement strategies, ways to push performance beyond normal limits. Corporations give employees unlimited energy drinks and expect 80-hour work weeks. Athletes take performance-enhancing drugs to achieve marginal improvements. Students abuse study drugs to handle excessive academic pressure. But bodies aren't machines you can overclock indefinitely. Chemistry that provides artificial enhancement today causes collapse tomorrow. Short-term gains purchased with stimulants always come at long-term cost. The German military learned this lesson the hard way. They chose pharmaceutical enhancement. They achieved spectacular short-term results, and they paid catastrophic long-term costs. By 1945, the German army was physically and psychologically broken, destroyed as much by its own pharmaceutical strategy as by enemy action. The American military chose adequacy, mild stimulants, sustainable energy, boring but reliable. And boring but reliable won the war. 2 pills, one contained methamphetamine. The other contained ground coffee beans. Both were stimulants. Both increased alertness. Both helped soldiers fight longer. But only one was sustainable. Only one allowed soldiers to function for years rather than months. Only one didn't destroy the army using it. Germany gave its soldiers crystal meth and told them they were superhuman. For a few months in 1940, they were. Then chemistry failed. Bodies collapsed. The pharmaceutical advantage became a pharmaceutical disaster. America gave its soldiers coffee and told them it was enough. It was. Not spectacular, not superhuman, just adequate. But adequate, maintained consistently for years, defeats spectacular that collapses after months. The lesson is simple. There are no shortcuts. You cannot chemically enhance your way past human limitations without eventually paying catastrophic costs. The side that accepts human limits and works sustainably within them will outlast the side that tries to exceed them through chemistry. Nazi soldiers got crystal meth daily. American GIs had coffee and chocolate. The meth seemed more powerful. The coffee seemed mundane. But at the end of 5 years of total war, the side with coffee was still standing, and the side with meth had collapsed. Sometimes boring wins, sometimes adequate is optimal, and sometimes the real performance enhancement is just getting enough sleep and drinking reasonable amounts of coffee. Germany learned this lesson too late. By the time they realized pharmaceutical enhancement was destroying them, the damage was permanent. Their soldiers were broken, their medical system was overwhelmed, their army was exhausted beyond recovery. The pills that were supposed to win the war had helped lose it instead.